Ja, god eftermiddag og velkommen her til et, så jeg godt lovet på forhånd, et spændende arrangement. En speciel velkomst til Marilyn Gallagher fra Ontario. Det er sådan, at vi har gang i rigtig mange forandringer, vi har gang i rigtig mange nye ting, og vi har brug for at blive inspireret udefra. Noget af det, som vi har følt os i skolelederkredse og også fra vores politiske udvalg har følt os inspireret af, det var en tur til Ontario. Og den inspiration var så kraftig, at vi tænkte, at vi måtte gøre noget for at dele lige præcis den oplevelse, som vi havde. Og derfor har vi indbudt Marilyn. Og der skal jeg sige, at det foregik på den måde, at vi havde en aften, hvor vi var ude at spise, og så sådan lidt henslængt, så siger jeg, var det ikke en idé at komme til Horsens? Og Marilyn svarede ja. Og det er sådan måske det, der er kendetegnende for Marilyn, det er, at hun får tingene til at ske, og hun er ganske fortagsom. Men jeg skal ikke bruge tiden, det er Marilyn, I skal høre på. Og der findes 2 navne, som jeg har lært er kendte fra Ontario. Den ene, det er Justin Bieber, og den anden, det er Marilyn. Og vi er heldige med at have Marilyn, så velkommen til dig.
Yes, I was a big hit with the grade 4 crowd when I said I had met Justin Bieber. I didn't get into a lot of detail to suggest that I think he was in about grade 7 at the time, or maybe grade 9. He was in school somewhere that I'd met him anyway. Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to have some time with you here today. And I want to begin my conversation with you, first of all, by thanking you for taking the time at what I know is a long and busy professional day to add on to that day by coming here to reflect on your teaching and to think about how changes could be made to make it even better. Because that's actually the topic of my conversation. It's to share with you some of the things we're doing in Ontario. And they won't be the exact answers for Denmark, because you have your own country and your own culture. But some of what the teachers in Ontario are working on and are doing, in fact, can be the center of some conversations that you need to have with your colleagues to look at how you could be even better with your own students here in Denmark. And I say even better because Denmark and Ontario in Canada have a lot in common. You have a beautiful country. I like to think we do it in Canada as well. You have marvelous people who are friendly and polite and caring. And mostly we like to think we are that in Canada. You have a strong social service net, which means that you believe every person has dignity and that every person has an unalienable right to the things that would allow them to have a successful life. It's why you have universal health care. It's why you have such a good school system. It's why you have daycare and early care that's universally accessible and free, and we're not there yet in Ontario, but we're working on it. We're learning from places like Denmark. And one of the other things that I think Ontario and Denmark have in common is we both have a very highly qualified, very capable teaching profession. Our teachers in Ontario are incredibly good at what they do. And they're getting better. Now, did you hear that connection? People in teaching need to get better at what they do. Not because they're bad in the first place, but because our kids deserve it. The work that we do as teachers, in my view, and as a product of the research, is an amazing task. It is a privilege, and that's one of my main messages to you. We are privileged to be teachers. And I started out my career just like you, Started out my career a lot longer ago than you probably, because I've been doing this for over 40 years now. But I started out teaching math and computer science in a city in southern Ontario. And my city is in Windsor. It's right across the river from Detroit, Michigan. It's a manufacturing city. And so some of my students came to school better prepared for success than others. And I think that's something else we have to acknowledge. One of the other reasons that even if we are really, really good as a teacher, that we have to keep learning to be better, is that our children have a very different world that they're going to live in and need to succeed in than any of us would have faced. Now, I'm older than you are. I can remember, and this is really going to date me, okay? I can remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my father waking me up at night one night and taking me outside into the side yard of our farmhouse and pointing up at the sky and saying to me, "Can you find the star that's moving?" And I looked and I looked and I looked, and finally we found it. It was not very bright, but it was moving ever so slowly across the sky. And he said to me, "That star is different than all the rest of the stars up there. That star has been put there by man." The light I was watching was Sputnik, Russia's first satellite, in the late 50s. And my father said, "I woke you up today and brought you out here so you could see this star that man put in the sky and understand that this is the day your world has changed forever." Now, when you think about that, my father was probably 60 years old at that point in time. He had me rather late in life. That was an amazing view of the future that he presented. When we look at the pace of change in our world today, it has to be clear to all of us that our children are going to have different problems to solve than we had. They're going to have a different attitude towards their world and their neighborhood. You know, 2 or 3 generations ago, people lived in a home and they traveled at most 10 or 15 kilometers away. And then they started to learn to travel a little further, and perhaps people in this community in a previous generation would have thought going to Copenhagen was a huge trip. But now we see our world as a small planet. And we understand that the things that are in our world that are both good and bad are worldwide things. That our environmental problem is a global problem. That our economy and economic challenges are global. And so the solutions have to come from global thinking and from an ability that we have to help our children develop to think more deeply. It's no longer enough to know how to sound out letters and make words and be able to write okay and read simple things and just graduate from high school. First of all, those that don't graduate from high school are truly lost. The jobs that they do and that could be there for them won't exist in many ways. And if they do exist, they will be exceedingly low paid. And then, the things that our children will be asked to do in their societies, in their workplaces of the future, are also very different. So that says something to us as teachers. And it says something even more important, I think, for teachers who are very good at what they do. Because if you're good already at what you do, and teachers in Denmark are, then you actually have the potential to be able to make the changes that will educate your children for the generation and the world to come. It's that simple. We are privileged to teach. I can't think of anything else I would have wanted to do with my life. This notion of watching a spark come alive in a child's thought process and watching that and nurturing it and moving it along. It's very important work. If nothing else comes of my talk with you today, tomorrow morning when you're in front of the mirror and you're thinking, oh, gotta get going for another day. And you look yourself in the mirror because you're brushing your teeth or doing your makeup or whatever. Look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself you're a hero. Because there is no more important thing to do anywhere in the world than to pass our civilization on to the next generation. And that's what you do. And as a matter of fact, the most important people in being able to do that, in partnership with parents, are teachers. Without doubt. The research is very, very clear that if a child is going to learn better and learn more, it's because their teacher is going to teach better. It's the only way it happens. And so, working in education is a great, joyous thing that we get to do. But in some ways, it's also terrifying. Because it's a sacred trust. When we fail in our teaching with a child, we have a huge impact on that child's life. They begin to see themselves as less capable. And when they see themselves as less capable, the horizon starts to become lower, and it narrows, and it sometimes becomes a tunnel. You have in your hands the potential to change the future for the children in your care. And I know it's a big job. It's a big job, and it's scary, and it's a huge responsibility. But it's that reason that it's so important that we all figure out how to work together so that every week, every month, we're better than we were before. Now, the interesting thing is, for years and years and years, it was really difficult to figure out how to do that. It was like people would come by like some kind of snake oil salesman. We used to have them in the country as it was developing. People would show up with a wagon and say, here, if you buy these pills, it'll cure your liver, it'll clear your skin, it'll cure everything, right? We called them snake oil salesmen because they sold you stuff that wasn't good. The truth is, for a long time, lots of people would come by and say, here's how you teach better, just do this. And a lot of that didn't work. The really exciting thing about being in teaching today is that there's much more accurate research available that tells us how to differentiate and know the difference between things that can really change the year for our kids and things that can't. Right? We don't have to invent those things all the time. We can learn from the research. We can learn from each other. We can also learn as teachers to be more reflective and precise in our own teaching. And by that I mean, in my earlier part of my career, I would teach a lesson. I'd say, well, here are my students. Here's what I want them to learn today or for the next week or two. And I would teach it. And then I would test them, and 70, 80%, perhaps 90% of them would do well on the test, and we would move on. I was missing a really important step in my teaching. The step that I was missing was the notion that I needed to stop and say, well, it worked for these kids, but it didn't work for some of them. What could I do differently to have it work for more of them? What could I do differently that would help these students understand the work too? And I started to understand about the third year of my teaching career because I started listening to my students. And there I was one hot day in about May, and in my town it's the furthest southernmost point in Canada. So by May it's very hot and the school didn't have air conditioning. And I'm like sweating buckets and I'm very tired and I'm very frustrated. And my math student, Larry, was as tired and frustrated as I was. And I had him in at lunchtime or after school, and we were doing stuff on the blackboard, right? And I, go through the material with Larry, and he'd get stuck. So I'd show it to him again, and he'd get stuck. And I'd show it to him again, and he'd maybe get a little further, and then he'd get stuck. And as I was about to do it again, he looked at me and he said, "Miss, can I say something here?" I said, "Please do, Larry." He said, if I don't get it the first time you teach me, I don't think I'm going to get it if you just teach it the same way a little louder. And I thought, oh my word, he's absolutely right. I said, "Larry, you are gifted. You are smart." He said, "I don't think so, miss." I said, "Yeah, I think so, Larry. Because you just taught me something really important. You just taught me that I have to listen to my students, and I have to pay attention to where they are, and I have to listen to their thinking so that I can find new ways to teach better." So I said, "Larry, start that problem from the beginning and explain to me what you are doing." And he started talking away through it and got to where he always got stuck. And he said, "Now I don't know, miss." I said, "Well, just a minute." And I said, "Okay, well, what if we thought about it this way?" And I showed him a little different approach. And he went, oh, and he grabbed the chalk out of my hand, and he did the whole problem. And he and I smiled at each other, and the day didn't seem as hot or as frustrating. And off he went, knowing that he could do math. So here's the step I think we missed for a long, long time. How do we use our students' thinking? How do we work with them to give them the detailed information about their work, the feedback they need? And how do we hear their voices as feedback to improve our teaching? So one of the things in Ontario that we've learned to do better is this business of listening to our students and paying attention to the work they do in a very different way. So now when we mark their work, we don't just mark to see what their score is. We mark and we look to see what their thinking is. And sometimes we'll go back to them when we hand the test back and ask them, "What were you thinking here? How did you work your way through this?" Because that gives us clues. That's feedback to our teaching as we go forward. It allows us to be more precise in meeting individual students' needs. Because not every student learns the same way. Not every student learns at the same rate. It's one of the great joys of teaching. They're all over the map, right? And we need to be able to tune into that. So I usually start every one of my presentations with a slide like this. I get at my job right now, working with the Ministry of Education, I get to go and visit schools and classrooms. It's great. I get to be in a classroom and not have to have prepared the lesson. It's good stuff. Anyway, so I go to the classroom of this class, and this was a grade 4 or 5 class. So these would be children who were about 10 years old. And I went to this particular school because the teachers in this school had been working really hard as a group to improve their teaching and to improve student learning. They had been meeting together in a professional learning community dialogue. They'd been focusing on student work. They'd been looking for research that might help them do it better. They'd been helping each other forward, giving each other good advice and criticism about things that they could do. Critical friends. So I come out to this school as much as anything else just to simply congratulate them for the work they were doing, because it was really clear to all of us that they had come a long way in a couple of years. So I go into this grade 4 class, and at the back of the room there are these 4 little boys in an afternoon doing what little tables of 4 little boys do in classes at the back of the room in the middle of the day. And so I went up to them as much as anything so I could be close to them and they would stop misbehaving. Anyway, so I said to them, you know, your teachers have been working really hard to improve learning in your school and to improve their teaching. Have you noticed a difference? And they looked at me and they all nodded. Oh yeah, we've noticed a big difference. I said, well, what have you noticed? And this 10-year-old boy looked at me and said this. He said, we around here are improving each year. People around this school are getting smarter. And then he put his hand on his hip and he said, we're starting to think school has potential. We're starting to think school has potential. Now, I was like you, I kind of laughed. I thought, this is hilarious. And then I thought, you know what? This isn't just hilarious. This is profound. Because what is it we want for all of our children? Don't we want to think that on a school day they're going to get up in the morning and be excited about going to school? That they can hardly wait to get out the door and get to school because they know their classes are going to be places in which there's going to be all kinds of exciting stuff going on. And they're going to learn wonderful things. And they're going to work together with other students in the class to do their best. Because school has potential. And school is a place where their potential will be improved. Now, not every school on every morning is like that for every child in Ontario. I'm not going to pretend that it is. But there are more classes that are that way now than there used to be. And because Ontario teachers, and these are some of the best teachers in the world, before we started our reforms, before we started to change things, these teachers now know that part of the job of a teacher as a member of the teaching profession with that sacred trust to give kids the best possible future they can have, that part of that professional responsibility is to teach better next month than last month. Because the world's changing quickly, and our kids need it. Now, we pay attention to secondary school students, too. As a matter of fact, our minister has a student advisory council. We have 60 students from across the province that come and meet with the minister 3 or 4 times a year and give the minister advice about education. And the minister regularly asks them, what works well for you, what doesn't? These, by the way, are not the upwardly mobile young, would-be politicians of the future. We carefully select these kids from those who apply to be representative of all of our students. So our Student Advisory Council to the Minister includes students from all across the province. It includes some students who have just immigrated to our country and can barely speak English or French. It includes some students who have special needs. Last year it included a student who was on the autism spectrum. who in fact, when I called his principal and said, we've selected Douglas to be part of the Minister's Student Advisory Council, the principal said to me a thing that didn't help me think very highly of the principal, but the principal said to me, oh, that's got to be wrong, you can't do that. I said, well, why can't I do that? And he said, well, Douglas is on the autism spectrum. I said, yes, I know that. Well, his behavior is such that we can't even have him in school a whole day. We have to send him home every day. And I said, oh. Well, he said, so no, you can't have him meet with the minister. I said, well, he's on the council and he's going to meet with the minister. I said, what are the kinds of things that you in the school have been doing that help Douglas do better? And the principal said to me, pardon? I said, what are the things you do in the school that help Douglas be more successful in his classes so that he can stay in class with all the other children longer? Oh, well, I'll have to talk to the teacher. And I thought, wrong answer, Mr. Principal, because everybody in that school should know what it is that sets Douglas off. If Douglas is in the hallway and you go by him and some other kid is crowding his space and that's something that sets him off, we better know that. Douglas, by the way, came to the council meetings. When I called his mother and said we'd like him to be on the council, I said to her, what are the things that you can do with Douglas and we can do with Douglas to help him be more successful in those meetings with the minister and all the other children? And she said, oh, well, he needs to know that if he starts to get agitated, he has somewhere quiet to go. I said, oh, well, we can do that. That's easy. What else? What else? So between the mom and the teacher, by the way, who knew some things that would help, we were able to set up a scenario where when Douglas came to meet with the minister with all of the other people on the council, now he was verbal, so he was able to talk about what his needs and what it felt like to be a child who was different in a class. What it felt like to be in a class where the teacher went the extra mile and paid a lot of attention and tried to make sure the day went more smoothly for him. And what it felt like to be in a class where that didn't happen and he would invariably end up losing it and have to leave. Some kids need more help than others. But anyway, we listen to our students a lot. And one of the students on the Minister's Advisory Council said this, which I think is also quite profound. Education's not just about learning knowledge from a textbook, because that's what education might have been about 30 or 40, 50 years ago. Because the things you needed to know in the world could be found in a textbook. And if you knew those basic facts, you could kind of get through life pretty successfully. But that's not true anymore. And this is quite profound. Taking action by applying our knowledge to make an impact. That's what our kids see their future involves. So when we're teaching kids about something, are we teaching them to do things right? And to understand how to apply what they know in different circumstances. But a great example of that in your school today, right? Teaching them to be able to apply what they know and know how to do to different kinds of circumstances and problems. And then to look at it and see if what they've done has an impact. Now, if I'm going to hand the global environmental problem on to the next generation of kids, I'm going to try to live in that world while they fix it, I really want them to be able to do this. Right? Here's an interesting question. Isn't that what teaching should be? Not just knowing the way to do it the way we have in the past, but figuring out how to take that professional knowledge that is so deep within us and apply it in new ways in our classrooms, right? And knowing what that does in terms of impact on students. If I teach this differently, I think it will be better for my students. So I do it, and then I look and see, did they learn it better? What do I have to do to change how I approach it the next time? Anyway, little bit as we begin about Ontario. Canada's a pretty big place. The kids in the school today, when I talked to them, they were asking me about Canada, and I said, well, it's about 6,000 kilometers or so from coast to coast. They kind of went, ooh. And then I told them that over the years I've driven it from one end to the other, and they were pretty impressed with that. Ontario is that province you see there. We're not the biggest geographically, but we're the biggest population in Canada. In fact, we're 40% of Canada's population. And in addition to that 40% of Canada's population, we are, in fact, a very diverse province. If you've ever been to the city of Toronto, and you walk down the street in Toronto, you will know that we are our own United Nations. Right? As a matter of fact, it's only been in the last economic downturn that our immigration has fallen to 40% of Canada's immigration. We used to get 60% of Canada's immigrants. But then with the downturn in the economy and manufacturing suffering a bit and the oil industry doing better, they started going out west, where the oil jobs are. Now that the cost of oil is tanked, they're probably all going to come back to Ontario now. Now, it's an interesting challenge because, if I may, as someone who doesn't come from Europe, I think the challenge of diversity is a very difficult challenge for European countries. It's this notion that you have thousands of years of history, all the way back to the Vikings and before, as to who you are and who your culture is. And then there are all these people who look different and act different, and they're coming in, right? Let's think about the world today. It's a global world. The challenges, the economy, the business that we need to do with other countries is now global. To be successful in the future, we must be able to think globally and understand global cultures. In Ontario, we think this is one of our biggest economic advantages because we don't have to learn about other people's culture. We are those cultures. More than 1 in 5 of the children in Ontario's classrooms, kindergarten to grade 12, age 4 to 17, more than 1/5 start school speaking neither English nor French. So think about your classroom. 1/5 or more of your classroom doesn't speak the language of instruction. And when we look at these people as they come to our country, first of all, we all have some empathy for them because, quite frankly, one of the things that I find hugely entertaining when I visit Europe is asking how old certain buildings are. My hosts have been having me ask them this with almost every building we go to. Because there's nothing in North America that's more than 200 years old. 200 years ago, we had rocks and we had trees. We had First Nations and Aboriginal people. And we had rocks and we had trees. And water. There's actually a band in Canada that sings about this. We all came from somewhere else. My parents immigrated to Canada from Holland. All of us came over on a boat or a plane. Not the same boat, not the same plane, but we all came. And Europe doesn't have that tradition to the same extent. But here's the thing. Looking into the future, the economies that will do well are those that have learned to welcome diversity of thinking and diversity of everything else into their communities. And it's a huge challenge in Europe, I know. But I think it's one worth solving. Now, I don't have the answer for you there. I just lay out the challenge. Right? Because we know that every one of those people who've come from somewhere else to Canada, invariably they come for one reason. Whether they come from the Middle East or from Europe or from Asia or Africa or South America, right? They all come because they want a better life for their children. They want to be somewhere where their children can live in peace, where they can get a good education even if they can't pay for it. So what's the piece in Canada that we have to pay a lot of attention to? That economic prosperity that we need, that sense that our immigrants are feeling a part of our society, is only going to come if we can make sure that every one of those immigrant students learns at the same level as every other one. Here's the thing. We have a saying in Ontario that says, demographics are not destiny. Too often in education systems, if you're a child in poverty, you're going to be less successful in school. If you're a child of new immigrants, you're going to be less successful in school and in life. If you're a child that's different, with special needs, you'll not do as well in school. And there's two reasons for that. First of all, one I think is a sensible reason. And the sensible reason is that learning things are more difficult for you. So if we want equitable results, we don't start with equal at the beginning. Treating every child equally in a classroom isn't equitable. Because some children come along with parents who've given them books and read to them since they were in the womb. The parents shepherd them to school like mother ducks, protecting them lest they fall. Overprotecting them, I think, sometimes. And then there are the kids whose parents love them just as much, but who don't know how to connect with the school, who don't know how to do that kind of parenting. And so they send their kids to school with all the same hopes and dreams as everyone else. You know, we've done a lot of work in Ontario working on children living in poverty and the research around it. And we've set up schools that are in the core city of when I was a district school leader. Some of my schools were in the core area of the city, lots of children in poverty, lots of new immigrant kids. And we would give them social workers, we would give them smaller class sizes, we gave them breakfast and lunch programs, which everybody gets here, but not everybody in North America. We gave them all these extras, and the kids' results didn't go up. And it was very frustrating. And I would go and visit the schools and say, what's going on here, teachers? Can you tell me what's going on? And I heard a teacher say it one time. And it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. The teacher said, you know, compared to those schools out in the suburbs, lots more of our children come from homes where their parents don't feed them all the time. They come from homes where there are no books and no papers. They come from homes where nobody wants to listen to them talk. They come from all of these different backgrounds. The poor dears, what can we expect? Oh, did you hear that? The poor dears. These were some of, I'd already transferred some of my best teachers into this school. I had a person I thought was my best principal in that school. We were pouring everything into trying to help those schools get better. And a teacher says to me, the poor dears, what can we expect? Fact number one about teachers' impact. Children live up or down to the expectations the adults in their lives put in front of them. Got that? Mostly kids live up or down to what we expect of them. And when a teacher, I call it the poor dear syndrome now. So I don't want you to answer this one out loud. But when your children come into your classroom in the morning, are there some that you look at and think they won't do as well? Are we setting high expectations for all of our children? Truly in our hearts. Because when that little child looks into your eyes, they can see that. And it starts to help them form an opinion of themselves. And there's no reason, there's been studies of how much kids can learn. And for instance, a child living in poverty starts school with a vocabulary of about 500 to 700 words. A child in a middle class or upper class home starts school with a vocabulary on average of about 1,700 words. They start school with a huge gap in vocabulary. And if they can't say it, they can't organize to think it. Think about how we think. We think in words. So if we start out with only a third of the words of the kids sitting beside us, people are going to think we don't think as well. When maybe, just maybe, if I had an opportunity to learn more words, I could think better. And if they can say it, they can think it. If they can think it, they can write it. And if they learn to do that, they can put it together with a bunch of other stuff, and the world's a wonderful place. So, anyway, we've been working at that in Ontario. We're not perfect at it, but we're better than we were. And I actually have a way of measuring some of that impact. In grade 3 and grade 6, we test all of our students across the province in reading, writing, and math. And about 12, 13 years ago, we decided that we could do it better. Not by telling teachers, you shall do this, but by inviting teachers to figure out how to do it better and working with them to do that. Because the real experts on what needs to happen in a classroom are you folks sitting right in front of me. You've got the answers, you just may not know them yet. It takes some hard work to figure that out. So these are the results over the last 13, 14 years in reading, writing, and math in our schools. 13 years ago, only 54% of our children were meeting our provincial standard in reading, writing, and math. Just over half. It made me so sad. Right? Now, reading, writing, and math are not the only thing that a school does that matters. Schools are wonderful places where children learn to socialize with each other. They learn to have more human empathy. Right? They do physical activity. They learn their culture. They learn all sorts of important things, including well-being. But if a child can't read, write, and do basic math at a grade 6 level by the time they're about 10 or 12 years old, you got a real tough time on the well-being part, don't you? Because they know that the other kids can do stuff they can't. And they never really feel that good about themselves. The leading cause of kids dropping out of high school in Canada is poor literacy skill. We also wanted to pay attention to graduation from high school, being ready to go to college or university or an apprenticeship. And when we started, 68% of our kids were finishing high school within 5 years. We've now driven that up to 83%. And I think we're going to make an announcement that'll be a very positive one in the next month when we get the next year's data. As a matter of fact, I know it. They've shown me the data already. Anyway, And let me tell you why this one matters. The research says that when you graduate from high school, you're going to live longer. Isn't that interesting? At least in North America. I don't have Danish data. But it's true in enough places that I suspect it would be true here too. You live longer and you access the healthcare system less, even though you are older. Isn't that interesting? I go in and tell our premier that all the time. I say, don't give the money to healthcare, give it to education. Because we can reduce your costs in healthcare. And she just kind of looks at me and says, yeah, I know that, Mary Jean, but I can't do it all right now. Anyway, so as we look at it, right? You live longer, you lose the healthcare system less. You are if you graduate from high school, you are 1/7 as likely to ever end up in jail. Right? Either because you're smarter at not getting detected or you don't have to turn to crime to make a living, one of the two. If you graduate from high school compared to someone who doesn't, you are much more likely to have a career as opposed to intermittent jobs at low-paying wages and unemployment in between. If you graduate from high school compared to those who didn't, you are less likely to be divorced. That graduation diploma is a ticket to a happier life. So while literacy, reading, writing, and math are not the only things we do, and a graduation diploma is not the only thing that matters, we talk about them as the 2 golden tickets. The 2 things we have to give kids for sure, along with all those other things. But getting back to the reading, writing, and math, that means we need to know exactly where our kids are on those critical learning skills. And by the way, it's not just reading, writing, and math. Let me back up a little bit. This is some of the international data, and you'll be getting a copy, or you have a copy of this, but we know that our own provincial test results are accurate because they're confirmed by what we see worldwide. But here's the thing, our standards in the province on reading and writing and math don't just include being able to read a piece. It includes what we call higher order skills, critical thinking, the ability to make inferences. So for instance, on our grade 6 test, writing test, the kind of thing we would expect a student to be able to do to get to the provincial standard would be higher than the PISA test. Our provincial standard is scaled higher than the PISA tests, the international tests. What a student would have to do in our writing test is to read 2 or 3 passages about a topic, to be able to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant information, to be able to put those pieces together with what they already knew about a subject, and write something that was a cogent discussion about that topic in an appropriate style. A pretty high expectation, right? What if by accident we were actually teaching too low to our kids? What amazes us about, we've been integrating, for instance, our students with special needs for about 20 years. And you know what the most terrifying thing about it is? Every time we integrate more kids, their performance improves without challenging the performance of the other kids. Now, our teachers, after 20 years, are pretty skilled at being able to make this happen. So, the interesting thing there is, right, that every time we expect more of those children, they deliver. Oh, there's a really scary thought. And I'm going to take a break right now, because apparently we have coffee and tea and all of that good stuff, and I'm going to ask you to come back in 15 minutes? Something like that? Yeah. And then we're going to, by the way, in the second half, just so you don't wander out the door saying, well, that's fine, but what's that got to do with us? We're going to talk about ways in which you can actually do this in your classroom. Okay. Onward and I'm sure the people still to come back will do so quietly, and that's great. An interesting piece about the kind of reform we've been working on in Ontario that comes out of the first thing we see here, which the OECD reported on, which is that they recognize that our emphasis is not in telling teachers how to teach. We have a curriculum so they know what's expected to be taught at each grade level. We work with high expectations in our expectations of students. But we would never tell our teachers how to teach. That's their professional judgment and expertise as they go forward. But we do ask them to spend time together. Because as teachers, if we spend our time in the classroom with all of our kids and the door closed, and we don't talk openly about our teaching approaches, how will we ever learn to try new things? So it works better when teachers work together to help each other move forward. So one of the things we've been working on is emphasizing building critical thinking and problem-solving skills of our teachers. And by having them exercise their critical thinking and problem-solving skills, thinking about student learning, it turns out that they end up doing better as teachers. And their students learn those skills too. So when we ask our teachers to come together in a professional learning community, what we ask them to do is to talk about their students. If they're trying a new teaching strategy, and they've all agreed together in the 0 to 3 grade or the 4 to 6 or whatever, that they're going to try this new teaching strategy to try to improve outcomes with students, then we ask them when they come together to bring some student work with them, to bring a piece of writing, if it's writing you were working on, to the PLC from a student in the middle of their class. And perhaps a piece of writing from a student who's not doing so well. Because one of the things we've learned is if you put a bunch of teachers around a table and you say to them, now talk to each other about the good teaching strategies you have, they all kind of sit there. You know, I teach, I'm not special, I don't do anything that my colleagues don't do, I don't have anything to share here, is more or less how they feel. They're shy to say, hey, I got this great strategy. And often the ones who say they do actually don't. The quiet ones, they're the ones who've got really good stuff to share, but they don't know they should share it. So instead, we ask them to talk about student work. Because when some teacher in that circle is brave enough to say, I got this kid, and I've tried this new strategy with this kid, and I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. And look at his writing. It's not getting any better. Does anybody have any ideas? Notice that's different than the conversations some of the time in the staff room, right? Sometimes it's like, well, this kid did this and this kid did that, and it's not about how do we solve the problem. It's just sort of venting and sharing our frustration. And that's okay for the first 30 seconds of the conversation. Because this is a child who deserves his future too. So has anybody got any ideas about what else I can try? Has anybody had this problem before and found a way to move it forward? Usually lots of people have ideas to chip in then, right? Sometimes it's empathy. Yeah, no, I couldn't solve it either. But somebody around the table's got the answer more than 90% of the time. In Ontario, we started out with 3 goals. We wanted our kids, we wanted to raise the bar. We wanted all of our kids to do better in school. We wanted to work really especially hard with the kids who were the most vulnerable, the kids who had the most difficulty learning. Because while we wanted everybody to improve, we needed these kids to improve more quickly. Well, that's an interesting challenge. The kids who learn the most slowly, improving the most quickly. if we're going to narrow the gap in performance. And then we wanted to increase our graduation rate, and we wanted to build public confidence. And we just came out, having accomplished all that good stuff, we just came out with a new vision. We want graduates who are personally successful. We want them to be good people, nice family members, somebody that you like and want to spend time with, right? We want them to be economically productive. And we want them to be actively engaged citizens. And we're in the process right now of retooling our curriculum and what we ask our teachers to do in schools to pursue those things. But anyway, so how do we get there? Good question. Over the years, we've gotten kind of better at this. When we started this, we did not have a clue about how to do these things. You know, this wasn't some kind of magic answer somebody came up with. We posed the problem to our teachers and said, let's get together and figure this out. But we did learn some things along the way. And we see these 8 things as having a great impact on improving learning for students. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of them. The first one is we cannot change too many things in our lives at once. So there are lots of goals schools have. 11, I was told today, and that's fine. But when it comes to trying to change what we're doing as teachers in our classroom every day, we can't do 11 all at once, right? We have to pick the 3 or 4 that we're going to work on for the next couple of months and focus on those. Because guess what? I have a busy life. Usually one of my goals is to lose weight and get healthier. You can see I have not succeeded. I'm hoping when I retire, if my life is less busy, suddenly I'll get better at it, but I don't know. I've been living 60 years on the wrong side of that curve. But the point is, if we really focus, not just the general goals for the school, but our goals for what we're going to change. In other words, if the grade 3 teachers, got together and said, you know, we've noticed that our children have a problem doing this successfully. So let's try to figure out what we're going to change in how we approach it. What are we going to do differently? What's the teaching strategy we're going to change? And set that as a goal. And then actually go in and out of each other's classrooms. Because guess what? If as a group of 4 teachers, you agree you're going to try to teach using some new strategy, and you know your colleagues are coming in, looking around, there's kind of a little pressure there to actually do it, isn't there? If the doorway's closed, I can come back to the meeting a month later and say, yeah, I tried it, it didn't work. Right? And if we're visiting each other's classrooms as critical friends, then when we get together, and I say, I tried, and with this kid, it didn't work. One of my colleagues might have said, you know, I noticed something the other day when I was in your classroom. Have you thought about this? Or have you thought about that? Because there's wisdom in this room. You know ways to improve. You may not know necessarily ways to improve your own practice as easily. But each of you have golden secrets that if we could figure out how to share them, if you could figure out what they were, right? You could lift everybody's teaching. And nobody else can do that for you. The ministry can't, the principal can't. It's in you. And why go that extra mile? Because you're the ones that make the difference for kids who deserve to have their most richly imagined, best possible future. Anyway, so we've now got 4 goals in Ontario. Notice we've learned something from Denmark. We've moved well-being into our set of goals. It was kind of there before, but it didn't come in the top 4. And we decided that was one area in which we weren't good enough. And so we've added it. Now, leadership. Some school systems think leadership is what you get from the ministry or district superintendents or principals. And they need to lead. They need to lead, by the way, not just in managing or administering schools, but they need to be instructional leaders. So if your principals are moving in this direction, you should expect to see them in the hallways and in your classrooms more often. Now, the way we do it in Ontario is we tell our teachers, look, when the principal's just wandering in and out to see how the kids are learning, they're not doing an appraisal of you. There is a formal teacher appraisal process that you'll get lots of notice about. But principals need to know what's going on in classrooms to be able to assist teachers in finding new and better ways to learn. To be able to put together, a principal, when they go into your classroom and see something going on, may in fact know who the colleague is at the under end of the building that's really good at whatever it is you're struggling with. And they can make that connection. But you need to build a culture of trust and a culture in which everybody's in it together because kids are worth it. Notice almost everything I say comes back to the kid. That's what it's about. It's about their future and making sure that every one of them has every advantage. When we talk about leadership in Ontario schools, we ask everyone to lead. We want leaders among our teachers. The people who are going to lead some of those conversations in those professional learning communities. It doesn't have to always be the person the principal asked to do it. Right? Step forward. You have something important to offer. Anyway, we have to have high expectations of our kids. I've talked about that. In Ontario, we have a curriculum that says here's what children in grade 4 should learn. Here's what children in grade 5 should be able to do, etc. Grade 7 to 12, it's here's what children in grade 7 in math should be able to do, and in science and so on. So teachers know the skills that we expect of our students. Part of that is because we have a very mobile society. Some of my schools in my school district, I would say to the teachers, so how are things going? And they're saying, well, I think I'm making progress with my class, but it's October now, and when the province-wide tests are done in May, 40% of my children will have moved away and somebody else will have moved in. So how am I supposed to deal with that? 40% of the school changes schools in a year? I looked at it and thought, whoa, that's a lot. And then one other teacher in the staff room, I used to, whenever they were doing some improvement work, I'd drop into the schools sometimes and I'd sit there. Sometimes I'd buy them lunch because when they were eating, they'd say their honest thoughts. They'd forget I was there. Distract them with food and then you hear the truth. That may be what they're doing around here with me this week. Anyway. So I used to listen to them, and when this teacher said that, 40% of my kids turn over. So I'm not sure how that's going to impact my results. One of the other teachers said, yeah, but they'll be back. I said, what? They said, yeah, we have these kids who live in the poor parts of town. Right? And they live in one apartment, and they fall behind on the rent, and they get thrown out of it. So they move over to the other part of the city, and the kids go to a new school until they don't pay the bills there, and then they move again. So within a year or two, they'll all come back. There's about 5 schools that these kids shuffle through and around, all around the city. And all the teachers are nodding. And I thought, whoa, do I have a solution for that? So we started asking the teachers in those 5 schools to meet together and plan the sequence of what they were doing so that when the children moved, they didn't get dinosaurs twice and math not at all. It brought up the results. So sometimes it's about figuring out what the people around the table know that the planners don't know. Anyway, this slide has great meaning for us in Ontario because it sets priorities for our decisions. In the front, we have the most important thing of all. It's the instructional task. Richard Elmore at Harvard University has done a lot of research into teachers' instructional tasks and instructional rounds and that sort of stuff. And what it amounts to is this. The research is very clear that the teacher, of all the things a school can control in a child's life, the most important thing in its impact on the child and their learning is the teacher. It's the ability of the teacher to set an instructional task that is appropriate for the student. An interesting thing there. To know that it's appropriate for your student, you have to be able to assess where that student is. We call it assessment for learning. What do we know about where this child is right now? If I'm trying to teach this kid to write, where is he on that journey right now? Or if he's younger and I'm trying to teach him to read, which stage of learning to read well is he at? Because our goal by grade 3 is to have every child making the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. Right? So we're really desperately focused on getting every kid to that point in grade 3. So where exactly is this kid? What instructional task am I going to give him that will help him learn what is his next step or next stage of development? Right? And what am I going to be looking for to know that he's learned it? Right? So we have a learning goal. We have what's called a rich instructional task, something that's challenging for the student. And then we support him in learning it. And then we have success criteria. What is it that we want our children to learn? And how will we know? What are we looking for? And by the way, if you share that success criteria with students, so a student knows at the beginning of the job what it is he's supposed to do to be successful, he'll get better at it. Oh, now there's something interesting. You're going to tell him what you're going to test him on before you test him? Yeah. Think about that as an adult, right? We only get better if we know what better looks like. So we share the success criteria with kids. And then we look to see whether they've achieved it or not. And if they haven't, it's our responsibility, not the child's, to solve that problem. That's what I mean by a precision to our teaching approach. Right? That's what has to happen here. And guess what? It has to happen not just in one classroom. It has to happen in every classroom in the school. I call that the summer lottery, the opposite of that. It's the September lottery because school starts in September. In our school system, I understand here in Horsens it starts in May, August, whenever it starts. The lottery I'm talking about is the lottery that every one of us knows about and probably have participated in with our own kids. It's the conversation at the dinner table the weekend before school starts. It's, I hope you get Miss Smith this year. Anybody ever heard that, right? I hope you get Miss Smith this year. Now, why would a parent say that? I would suggest to you they would say that because parents in your community know who the teachers are that set great challenges for your kids and then help the kids rise to meet them. You know, It sounds in a parent's voice like this. Well, Miss Smith is tough. She expects a lot, and she doesn't take any guff from anybody. But at the end of the year, you will have learned more. Now, the research about teaching tells us the following. There was a piece of research a number of years ago that was done, and there are not a lot of longitudinal studies. But in this particular study, they went to teachers and they said, who are your kids of greatest promise in your classroom? The kids that you know are going to do really well. And the teachers identified them. Well, and who are the kids who aren't going to do so well? You just know it. And they identified those. And then without telling anybody about it, they gave the superstars, the great kids, average teachers. Teachers who were good, but average. And they gave the kids who weren't going to go anywhere the Miss Smiths, those teachers who have a way of challenging kids and supporting them. And then they came back and identified with their new teachers 3 years later who the teachers thought were the kids of great promise and who the teachers thought were the kids who were in trouble and not going to achieve so much. Anybody guess what the results told us? Almost without exception, the kids who were with the great teachers were identified 3 years later as being the smart, capable kids in the crowd. That's the power you have in your hands. Your extra effort, your focusing on how you get better, can make that kind of a difference in the kids' lives. And it'll make some difference for all of them. But for the kids whose parents don't know how to shepherd their little ducklings, for the vulnerable children in your schools and in your country, your impact will be greater. Because for those children, you're the only one in their lives who's able to do it. Did you get that? They don't have a parent who knows how to do it for them. You have that trust and that role. So it's worth getting better, no matter how good you are. It's about the instructional task. Now, if we're going to have every classroom in every school firing along like that, next comes the second most important job in the system. It's at the school level. It's the principal and vice principal. And their ability to become really good instructional leaders. Because the only schools where every classroom is firing along and improving all the time are those who have principals who are able to engage people in doing that. And so what we say is we want every classroom to be a place of high quality learning, and we want every school to focus on the things they need to do together, everyone in the school, facilitated by the principal, to focus on the things they need to do to make it more likely that every classroom is going to be that kind of place. And the school district, we want school districts doing the things they need to do to make it more likely that every school is going to do what they need to know and do in order to make sure every classroom is. You getting the picture here? And way up here in the unimportant corner are people like me, the ministry. What is it that we need to do to help school districts do what they need to do better? To help principals do what they need to do better? To help teachers do what they need to do better? That's my job, to work with 5,000 schools and 126,000 teachers to make sure that next week everybody's working to a higher standard. And I love it. So that makes your classroom a little more doable, don't you think? Anyway, we ask people to focus on some of these kinds of things. It's in your notes. I'm going to move on to a different thing. This slide represents a process we ask schools to go through. It's called a school improvement plan. The center of this is some research that we've done on what are the things a school has to have in place to be an effective school. All the stuff's available online. It's in English, not Danish. Sorry, but so be it. It starts with the student at the center, right? We know in order to teach with the kind of precision that I'm talking about, knowing where your kids, being able to diagnose where your kids are on a learning journey, that teachers have to be able to personalize instruction for almost every kid in the class at various times. And that in order to do that effectively, teachers need lots of professional learning. They need time to work together with their colleagues. They need encouragement to use that time well. Around the next circle are the things a school has to have in place. But the real strength of our school effectiveness framework is this stuff around the outside. And it starts here. We ask teams of people in every school in our province, all 5,000 schools, to come together and to ask themselves some questions about their school. What do we know about our students' achievement? What do we know about our students' lives and their well-being and our community and who our kids are? What do we know about the range of programs we have in our school and about whether our programs are challenging our students or not? Right? What perceptions do people have of our school? Some of this you might have to survey parents and ask them. Some of it you might want to survey the kids. Because we all have these anti-bullying programs. Have we ever asked our kids to tell us where in the playground or where in the school they feel bullied the most? They'll tell you. They'll say, yeah, I don't go down that hallway by the gym because you get picked on there, etc. And then we need to spend time as a group, not the whole staff, but the principal, the administration, some supervisor leaders, and some teachers, the kind of teachers who set the opinions in the staff. Come together and look at all of this data and try to make sense of it. And then they say, what do we need to change in our school? And I'm not talking the paint or the all that stuff's important. Take care of it. It has nothing to do with instruction. This is about what do we need to change in how we teach? What goals do we want to set? Maybe for the whole school, maybe for a particular set of grades, etc. So what are the goals for change we're going to set? No more than 3 or 4, please, at a time. Right? Well, if we're going to set those goals for how we're going to change, what are the teaching strategies that are going to allow us to do that? Those goals need to be specific. If we know that our kids are not good at writing, or not good at handling fractions, or whatever, right? What are the things we're going to do? How will we know they're better at fractions? Well, we want our kids to be able to add fractions, and instead of only getting 70% of them right, we want them to get 90% of them right. So what different teaching strategy are we going to take on to change that outcome? Right? So as a group, we say, what are we going to change? Now, maybe we don't know how to do that thing that somebody told us was going to do a better job. So maybe somebody in the group needs to go and do some research. Or maybe somebody has to talk to somebody in a school over there who knows more about it. Right? And do we need to go have some professional learning? The neat thing about YouTube and the internet is there are some great teaching videos out there. Again, they're in English but not Danish, but I will tell you that our department, and it's not Ontario that's saying this, we produce videos for teachers to help them in their learning. And they're all available free online. And I have the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne, Australia, has publicly said that they consider them to be the best quality teaching videos in the English-speaking world. And they use them with their students all the time. They're very specific. We ask a researcher to tell us something about a particular topic. And then we go to a teacher who's using that research to improve their teaching. And we ask the teacher to explain why they chose to do the things they did. Why did you choose this strategy? Why did you modify it this way? And then we show that teacher and their students in their classroom. And then the students tell us what they found that was good about it. About lots of different approaches to things. But wherever you find it, because those teaching strategies are here in Denmark too. So we use those for professional learning. Here's a really important step. When we make a change, we have to monitor. So when you're setting your goals and all agreeing that you're going to use a particular teaching strategy, you have to plan for this. If we're all going to try a particular approach to fractions, right? Then we need to be okay monitoring each other doing that. Because it's really easy on that Monday morning when you've had a busy weekend and you didn't have time to plan for the change to slide back into the old way of doing things. So we have to be able to hold each other accountable. That's lots better than principals holding you accountable, because then it's some kind of a top-down thing, right? We ask each other to play our best game and to live up to our promises to each other. We decide who's responsible for setting up professional learning or finding the resources, etc. And when we've done this, we evaluate our impact. Now, there's a version of that I'll come to in a minute for use in our professional learning cycles too. But here's the real reason, by the way, we ask you to bring student work to your professional learning conversations. Everything we do in a school, everything we do in a school has to be about the students learning. But it turns out that what students need to learn better is actually what teachers need to learn to teach better. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That when your students aren't doing well in a part of the curriculum, you need to find a better way to teach it. And we need to monitor student learning in order to decide that. So the school needs to be a place of learning for everybody. What do students need to learn better? Okay. What do teachers need to learn to support what students need to learn better? And what do school and district leaders, principals and district administrators need to learn better in order to help teachers learn better? And so on it goes. And at what point does our community, our parents, need to learn something better to help us along the way? And how are we going to do that? That's actually something I think you do a little better than our Ontario schools, is that parent piece. I've seen some great documents that you share with parents in some of the schools I visited today and some of the daycares. Here's the professional learning cycle. Together in a professional learning dialogue, you plan for a change, an improvement. You act upon that. You assess and observe the impact. You assess and observe each other's work in that. And then you reflect. Did it work or not? If it didn't work, either I'm doing the wrong thing. We actually had one teacher. We were doing some work with teachers in one of these cycles. And all of a sudden, in the middle of a professional workshop, teachers are working at tables, this teacher went, "Oh no!" I said, What's going on here? You know what? I set this learning goal, I developed a strategy to teach it, and now as I look at my kids' work, if they had done the task that I asked them perfectly, they still wouldn't have learned what it was I wanted them to learn in the first place. You ever done that? You want a kid to learn this and you think this is going to get them there, when it turns out this just teaches them something that's totally unrelated? Well, whose fault is that they didn't learn it, right? Anyway, so you have to keep watching and reflecting and observing and evaluating what you're doing and whether it's successful. Stephen Katz is a Canadian researcher who's been doing some really good work on professional learning community dialogues. And he says that the power of a professional learning community, the real power of it, is that members of the group engage together on a problem of practice. You're really busy people. You don't have time to come to a meeting that has no impact on anybody. Right? Why sit down together around a table if it's not going to make a difference? Well, if you're sitting around a table in a PLC and it's not making a difference, then look at yourselves around the table, because that's who owns the change. Right? They engage together in challenges of practice so that their understanding of the challenge goes deeper. Does that make sense? And is more unified, so that you come together around the problem eventually. Sometimes it gets really ugly in the fighting about it on the way there. Right? And that's okay too. Through their investigations, and sometimes you have to go back at it a few times, right? Proposed solutions emerge that you then take to your classroom and test out, right? And if you repeat that process as you go through the curriculum, your teaching strategies become more powerful and more sophisticated. You get better at what you're doing. You know what else? It gets easier. Because you got more brains at the table. You're flying higher on the lift of the wings around you. Do they call them Canada geese in Europe when they fly over here? They're big honking geese. And they exist in Canada. And every year they fly all the way from Hudson's Bay in northern Canada to South America in the winter to avoid all that snow and ice, which is not a bad idea. And then in the spring they fly all the way back and they have their babies in northern Canada. And when they fly in a V formation. One bird flies at the front. And the next bird lines up. One here and one there. One here and one there and one here and one there. Anybody ever wonder why they do that? Interesting. They do that because it turns out that you can fly 70% further by benefiting from the lift of the wing action in front of you. The bird in the front is doing most of the work. And the Canadian geese are pretty smart, actually, because the one in the front, when he gets tired, drops back and gets in line behind somebody else who's flying ahead of him. And somebody else takes the heavy leadership role for a while. When you're thinking about whether your PLCs are useful or not, think about those geese. Think about the geese. Everybody's contributing. What you end up with is more sophisticated. You have a sense of common purpose. And it gets easier with each cycle as you go along. Remember this, though, too. That together is not better if it's groupthink. You know? Oh, they're deciding to do this. Well, it's a bunch of hogwash, but I'm not going to tell them. It's not going to work, but I'm not going to say it. Because the group's afraid to listen to somebody with a different opinion. That's not a good PLC. You won't find the best ideas when a bunch of people are holding back. Or when somebody says something different, everybody jumps on them. That's called bullying, by the way. It happens in a group of teachers, too. We're looking for diversity of opinion. We're looking for shared ownership of the tasks. And eventually, while you try 3 or 4 good ideas, it'll become clear that these 2 were really good ideas and this one was just a mistake. We need to be honest with each other and say, you know what? This was just a new idea. It wasn't a good idea. We need to stop doing that because we don't have time to waste and neither do our kids. Right? Several slides in here about experiential education. I'm going to talk about this one particularly because it represents a bit of a focus in our thinking in Ontario, and some of it came from a Denmark school or a Danish school. We're starting to focus more on experiential education for kids, giving kids an opportunity to do real things that they find interesting and that they can select. And some of that might be educational programs that link work and career. This is mostly for secondary, we'll get to that, although not all. Volunteer experience. Project-based cross-curricular. I saw a grade 7 class in a school in Denmark just about an hour outside of Copenhagen a few years ago. That was what I thought was one of the best examples of cross-curricular project-based learning that I've ever seen. And when we wrote our new vision in Ontario, which I wrote most of, right, I kept thinking about that school in Denmark, right? I watched a group of 7 or 8 grade 7 kids getting ready for this project that they were going to have to do when they were in grade 9 to graduate, so the school said we're going to have them do it in grade 7 too, so they can learn the skills. And what they were doing is these kids had a hypothesis, there's the scientific method in here, they had a hypothesis that if you paid attention to the events at a particular point in history, those events would influence fashion design a few years later. And I thought, yeah, I could see the Danish focus on fashion and on design principles coming through here. This is cool, right? So they had gone and looked back in each decade from 1900 to 2010. And they had looked to see what the big events in history were in each of those decades. And then they'd looked about 5 years later to see what fashion looked like. And we're looking to see what the connections were. Can you see the critical thinking that's involved in that project? And the ability to apply learning? Those are 21st century skills. In a world in which every piece of information the world ever knew is available online in 30 seconds or less, we better be able to figure out how to analyze information and think about it critically and decide whether it's relevant or irrelevant or accurate or not accurate. These kids sort of said, well, you got the space race of the 60s. That's how we ended up with all those polyester leisure suits in the 70s. I thought, okay, so we shouldn't have had a space race then. Anyway, it was a marvelous project. And at the end of the day, they were going to show this to their colleagues. They had a kid working on a computer to do a timeline with pictures comparing the events of fashion and all the other. They had kids making clothing design from all of the different decades to wear in front of the kids. It was a marvelous learning experience. They learned how to direct their own actions and set priorities in their time. They learned how to work together in a group that was functioning some days and not functioning others. They learned all kinds of good stuff. So we're learning from you in Ontario too. We have a couple of programs in high school that we pay particular attention to that are linking work and career in school. And because that's not your area of teaching, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But what we do is have opportunities for kids at all parts of our secondary school to go out and connect with the workplace. So I was actually talking to somebody at break, I think, break, about the prison in Horsens. I had a chance to go on a tour yesterday. It was marvelous. If you've not been to your prison, you got to check it out when it opens. They gave me a special tour, not because of anything I'd done. Right? Anyway, it was great though. It was interesting and fascinating to hear it. And what I said was, do you have some kids in your local high schools who are really interested in history? Wouldn't it be interesting for them to work in the summer at the prison with the historian there, documenting the history and putting the displays in a museum together? What a marvelous way for those kids to learn about applying history. Anyway, so we do that. This is an interesting one, dual credit. Normally, a lot of places have the ability for an accelerated, good student to go to college half a year early and take college courses. We have that kind of program, but we have it for the kids who've dropped out of high school. Kids who dropped out of high school, we hunt them down, usually around the shopping malls, right? Or the bars on a Friday night. And we hunt them down and we say, well, okay, we want you to come back to school. And they go, no, not going to do it. Oh, come on, we want you to come back to school. We can help you graduate. There is no way I am ever going back to that high school. It was an awful place for me. I barely escaped. I'm not going back, miss. Well, what if we could have you go to college? Well, I can't go to college. I didn't graduate from high school. Yeah, we got a special program for you. We have a high school teacher on the college campus. And these kids who have dropped out go there. They get a college student card. They're like really cool because they're a college student. They can impress the girls in the bar on a Friday night. They get to go to use the college facilities. And the teacher that's there does high school courses with them in a classroom in the college. And they go to one college course during the day. And when they come back from that college course, the teacher helps them keep organized and be successful. Those kids are passing 70% of the college courses they take. And they learn that they can go to college. Many of those kids decide to go back to high school so that they can graduate and go to college full time. And it was never on their list of dreams before then. Are there things in your schools and in your classrooms you need to think about that would give kids bigger dreams and lift them up to reach it? And now I want to talk a little bit about equity. No more than 3 minutes. We all know about this young woman, Malala. I raise up my voice, not so I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. We cannot succeed when half of us are held back. Now, Malala put her life on the line not once but several times to advocate for girls' education in her country. She was willing to give her life because there were children whose dreams were being limited. Now, it may not be the girls in Danish society, but who are the children in your schools whom your society, your school, your traditional notions are not giving them the biggest dreams they should have? And once we help them dream bigger, how do we change the outcome? That's the real game. Because good teachers make a huge difference for those children. It's why we all need to get better. I'm going to share with you some data, and here's why you have to use data. This represents the grade 6 writing results of Ontario students and different groups of Ontario students over the last 12 years. And what you have here in this blue line in the middle is the achievement of all of our students on that grade 6 writing test, from 54% of our kids up to 78%. I should tell you, by the way, that that's all of our students. So even a child who has such significant special needs that writing wouldn't be an appropriate task for them is counted. They don't have to write the test. But if they don't write the test, they're counted as someone who didn't pass it. Because we don't want people in our schools arguing about the label you put on a kid so you can exempt them from the test so it makes your results look better. We want people talking about whether having the child do the test will tell them something that will allow them to teach them better the next time around. It's about improvement for the kid. So here are the results for all of our students. Here are the results for the girls. Here are the results for the boys. So maybe we've narrowed that gap a little bit, but not much. We have not solved the gender problem yet in Ontario. We're working on it. Although our international test results suggest we've closed the gap by about a third, and we're working on why that is. This next one is critical for Ontario's schools. This line that started out with a 30% performance gap and is now down to 3%, that's the writing test results for our new English language learners. For those 1 in 5 students who come to our schools not speaking the language of instruction. Now, you know what's interesting? Our teachers back here who taught English as a second language would have said they knew what they were doing. They were really good at what they were doing. And they were. But in 10 years of working together and saying, how can we do it better? We've figured out how to change the world for those children. And here's another one. This line, that's gone from 12, so it was a 42% gap, to 46, down to a less than 30% gap. Those are our children with identified special needs. These are our kids who are blind or are deaf or who are Down syndrome or who are autistic or who are developmentally challenged and any other number of things you want to talk about. And I swear to you, back then, what did I do? I swear to you, back then, at the beginning of this, with all of the love and caring and professional excellence we knew about in Ontario schools, with a teaching cadre who were the best in the world 12 years ago or among the best in the world, we would not have believed that we could have that impact on those children. Folks, you don't know the power you have until you put your shoulder to the wheel and try harder and try smarter. So if my message to you today has no other impact than that, please know inside of you, if you work together differently, you have the power to change that life. We work with low-achieving schools, too. We take the schools where we have lots of children who are immigrants and on welfare and so on and so forth, and I have about 1 minute left. 12 years ago, we had 760 schools where fewer than a third of our students met provincial standard on our reading and writing tests. 760 schools out of 4,000 elementary schools. We have about 4,000 elementary, 1,000 secondary. We now have 63 schools where less than 50% of the students are at provincial standard. And we haven't changed the schools, we haven't changed the teachers, we haven't changed the principals. We've worked with staffs to have them learn how they can work together better. It's there for you. And you can't tell me that Danish children don't deserve the same stuff that Ontario's kids are getting. You can't tell me that Danish children can't achieve every bit as much as Ontario kids. I don't believe it. It's in your hands. It's in your hands. The truth is, every child in every one of your classrooms can learn. And every year or two you delay, those kids move on, and their futures are a little bit smaller than they could have been. If you find a way forward to improve what you do with that sense of urgency, you will love your jobs even more. I promise. You've been marvelous to speak with today. Thank you for taking your turn and your time to be with me, rather. And I think the word the students in grade 4 taught me were tuck. Tuck? Yes. Tuck. Thank you.
Ja, jeg har ikke ret meget at sige andet end, at de ting, som Jean har fortalt os om, der var vi så heldige at se, at det fungerer faktisk også i virkeligheden. Det var stærkt, og det har det også været at høre, høre indlægget her og foredrag. Jeg håber, I kan bruge det. Glæd jer til i morgen. Der er en ny dag, hvor der er gode muligheder. Tak fordi I vil bruge jeres tid på det. Tak for nu.